Dr. Emily Hannum is the Associate Dean for Social Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, where she oversees the departments of Anthropology, Criminology, Economics, History, and Sociology of Science, Political Science, and Sociology, along with multiple research centers. She's a professor of sociology with a secondary appointment in the Graduate School of Education and serves as Associate Director of the Populations Studies Center. As a leading scholar on education, poverty, and social mobility, Dr. Hannum directed a 15-year longitudinal study on childhood poverty and upward mobility in China and remains actively engaged in national and regional studies on children's education, health, and welfare. She has consulted for global organizations including the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank Institute, and UNESCO. Within Penn, she has held key leadership roles, serving as graduate chair in sociology between 2008 and 2015, associate chair between 2016 and 2017. She is also a member of the graduate groups in demography and international studies and is affiliated with the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and the Center for East Asian Studies. Please join me in welcoming our dean.
Thank you so much for giving me a chance to be part of the welcome panel for this event. I'm really thrilled to see this event happening, and on behalf of the school, I wanted to welcome everybody to this conference. I think it's amazing that we're able to host you here today for a conference on such an important topic. I think that the breadth and significance of the topics covered, which I tried to kind of capture visually here in this word cloud generated from the conference program, the topics are very ambitious in their scope, and I think especially in the current time, being able to meet together and work on these important topics is hugely important. I wanted to say just a couple of words about the sort of demographic significance of the topic as a demographer. I looked for a kind of estimate of the global population that is considered to be residing in the global south, and I didn't find one definition. I found several definitions, but all of them speak to the point that the global south is a demographically hugely significant realm within which to be studying. I think these quotes give some examples. There's no universally accepted definition of countries that belong to the global south category. By one definition, the global south is home to over 6 billion people. Another source says, by one definition, the global south represents 85% of the world's population. Another source says it's certainly true that 88% of the world's population lives outside the West in what is now called the global south. I think this is a sort of well-known fact for us. I think it's also very important to recognize that demographically, the places that are the kind of focus of the work that we are discussing here today are the places that are growing rapidly in the world. So the 46 least developed countries are among the world's fastest growing. This is according to a UN document, World Population Prospects 2022. Many of these places are projected to double in population between 2022 and 2050, putting additional pressure on resources and posing challenges to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I think that the point I wanted to make as far as this conference is that in addition to the ambitious kind of intellectual reach of the conference, the kinds of issues and places that are, I think, particularly important in the conference today are also places that are becoming increasingly demographically important in the world. Because my own work is focused on children and I'm doing some work on climate hazards, I wanted to present one final slide that is just an example of the kinds of, I think, of the importance of the kind of interconnectivity of different kinds of disruptions that you're focusing on here today. This is a UNICEF estimate of the number of students affected by climate-related school disruptions in 2024, and this is grouped by UNICEF World Region. And here I think you can see that there are many places where there's a combination of large population and a significant degree of economic precarity and a huge amount of vulnerability to climate hazards. And this is creating a situation where people now are having their livelihoods disrupted and people's children are having their educations disrupted going forward in places where there are also conflict or conflict or other kinds of disruptions going on, you will have multiple factors that are disequalizing the sort of global situation of children. And more broadly, I think the point that I really noticed looking at the program here is that these interconnected factors are all important to consider together as we think about disruptions and precarity in the lives of people in the global South. So thank you very much, and I'm so thrilled again that we are hosting this conference here today, and I wish you a wonderful couple of days.
Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of the department, my colleague, Dr. Tukufu Zuberi. He is the Lasri Family Professor of Race Relations and a Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at this university. He has held visiting professorship at institutions across Uganda, Tanzania, Brazil, and Colombia. As the founding director of the Center for Africana Studies between 2002 and 2008, and former chair of the Department of Sociology between 2007 and 2013, his work explores the meaning of humanity, citizenship, and identity. His research spans multiple mediums, including academia, television, museum curation, and documentary filmmaking. He has authored several influential books, including Swing Low, Swing Chariot, The Mortality Cost of Colonizing Liberia, Thicker Than Blood, How Racial Statistics Lie, and African Independence, How Africa Shapes the World. Additionally, he co-edited White Logic, White Methods, Racism and Methodology, which won the Oliver Cromwell Cox Book Award. Beyond academia, Dr. Zuberi has curated numerous museum exhibitions, including Ties of Freedom, African Presence on the Delaware, and Black Bodies in Propaganda, the Art of the War poster, which has traveled nationally. He redesigned the Penn Museum Africa Gallery and continues to curate international exhibitions on African history and representation. From 2003 to 2014, he was host of PBS History Detectives and later co-produced History Detective Special Investigation, from which I learned my colleague made a lot of money. His documentary, African Independence, was featured in numerous film festivals, and his recent works, Before Things Fell Apart and Decolonizing the Narrative, examine African history and material culture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Zuberi.
I don't know where this money is, but I really want to express my gratitude and appreciation for the organizers of this very important conference, Everyday Lives of Instability in the Global South. I like to think, now I'm a sociologist, so sociologists, when they think about the study of everyday life, they often go back to Alvin Gouldner, who wrote a paper called The Study of, Sociology of Everyday Life. But you know, us in Africana, we never rest. When they say they discovered something, we get to investigate it. And I would, at minimum, I mean, you know, when in his paper, he pushes it back to looking at the Greek life and the study there, so study. But when I push, at least in this modern period, I like to think of, and don't take this wrong, you all will think I take everything back to Du Bois. But Du Bois did write The Souls of Black Folk, and he was trying to get in this vein of activity. And there's a brother in South Africa who wrote a book called Native Life in South Africa a few years later. What's his name? There we go. There we go. So, you know, at least those, for me, those are kind of my anchors so I can understand what you all are doing here today. And I really do appreciate that. Du Bois would later go on to write The Philadelphia Negro, and he wrote Black Reconstruction. In Black Reconstruction, he theorized not only how important everyday life was, but he theorized that the general strike is really the cause of the success of the North in this thing. So I really do appreciate this conference being here. I think it's natural and logical because, you know, we trace our own history back to Du Bois coming here. They didn't treat him righteously, but he came here and he wrote the Philadelphia Negro, which was a study. They asked him to come and tell them why Black people were doing what they were doing, and he expanded that to include what Black people needed and how they were living their lives, and proposed that such a center like ours would be created. It took, you know, almost 100 years for that to happen, but here we are, and we stand very proud to have the work. I have looked at the agenda, and it is exciting. It ranges from medical research, climate research, all the way to looking at art, and how all of these interactions kind of are good places to understand the everyday life of the people. On the behalf of the Department of Africana Studies, I would like to welcome you all with a warm embrace, and I wish you all the success in your deliberations as you advance our thought and thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So to introduce our keynote speaker, I hope he's keen, is Dr. Gayatri Sagar. Gayatri is a postdoctoral research fellow here at the center. I was one of Gayatri's two supervisors at Oxford, so you can imagine how proud I am to be co-hosting this conference with her. These are the kinds of things that supervisors like to brag about. So I am really, very pleased and honored to ask her to introduce our keynote speaker. Gayatri.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Abdulmalik Simon. Professor Simon is a senior professorial fellow at the Urban Institute, University of Sheffield, the co-director of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab of the Polytechnic University of Turin, and a fellow at Humanities Urban Future Program at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. Professor Simon has also had research positions at the Max Planck Institute, the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, and the Rujak Center for Urban Studies in Jakarta. He is also the author of many groundbreaking works, including most recently The Surrounds, Urban Life Within and Beyond Capture. Professor Simon's research spans a rich and expansive array of intersecting concerns, which speak directly to the various themes we will be discussing today, including the production of everyday life for urban majorities in the Global South, infrastructural imaginaries, collective affect, global Blackness, and the histories of the present for Muslim working classes. Along with his prodigious contribution to scholarly research, Professor Simon has also been engaged in policy efforts to build more viable, egalitarian, and inclusive urban institutions. Over the past 30 years, he has worked on the remaking of municipal systems, trained local government personnel, and designed collaborative partnerships with planners, residents, artists, as well as politicians. We're very pleased and grateful that Professor Simon has agreed to deliver the inaugural address on urban ecologies of global Black lives. So,
thank you, Gayatri, for the introduction. Thank you very much for the opportunity to say some words to you at this really important gathering. I'm sorry I can't be there. I'm about as far away from Philly as you possibly can get. But what I will do is I will say some words based on a lyric by Philadelphia's own Moore Mother. It's a kind of essay on urban philosophy, and I have put the talk on the screen, And so I will go quite fast. It's a talk in 3 parts. The first part is just some outline of the kind of key dilemmas, dynamics of a kind of burgeoning field of Black ecologies, but also focus on a particular series of thoughts on what Blackness is within this notion of Black ecologies. And then to the second part is how this resonates more generally in terms of everyday life dynamics across some urban areas of the South. And then the third is a kind of short reflection on my neighborhood, my home neighborhood in Brooklyn, a kind of a brief poetic conclusion. So key dimensions of Black ecologies. Foreclosure of and indifference to the value of a self-formed human subject could be manifested in the capacity of the Black body to extend itself into the very surrounds, terrain, materiality of their limited world of operations. Here, an extraordinary attunement to the operations of the earth and its varying atmospheres and ways of being signaled a detachment from the need to be human as conventionally defined. Here, the processes of social reproduction were experienced in concert with the rhythms of other forms of liveliness. So how is such attunement manifested today, given that Black populations are disproportionately exposed to premature death, perform everyday living in persistent atmospheres of anti-Blackness, as Blackness itself becomes more diverse in its manifestations? Black people across different geographies and political histories have inhabited the planet and contribute to the sustenance of its metabolic processes in ways that remain unprecedented and unparalleled. With vernaculars and social formations and temporal orientations and techne that have had to navigate the tricky conundrum of Black people attempting to insert themselves into what passes as the normative ethos and demeanors of how specific geographies should be inhabited, whose affordances have largely been foreclosed or distributed unevenly, while simultaneously refusing to normalize themselves according to the structures of power and codes that have subjugated them. So key ongoing questions. If Blackness has always been associated with various enclosures, from the plantation to ghettos to Black jobs to sacrifice zones, and extraction from cheap labor to extraordinary skills, how do Black ecologies function as an eruptive force against such enclosure and extraction, from greenwashing to carbon trading and other notions that dissociate histories of anti-Blackness and violence that emerge from racial oppression and continue to impact upon the functioning of land, sea, and air? How to secure the processes and dispositions of Black well-being that emerge from experimentations emanating from Black cultural institutions, from an aesthetic dimension shaping specific sensibilities and orientation to existing Black life and its capacities for imagining possible futures. These aesthetic considerations are also facets of political action in that they constitute ways of experiencing and assessing Black existence in terms that extend beyond the frames of compensation, endurance, and complicity. And third, Black world-making processes that constitute environmental infrastructures where materials meet, engage, and produce new worlds. The materials may be of very different kinds: myths, rivers, snakes, fishing, boats, swimming, dams, ceremonies, and molecules, all push and pull at what is social, natural, environmental, or technical, and their intersections largely take place outside of any available conceptual framework or vernaculars. So then what are the appropriate languages of conveyance and practice if we don't have always available discernible vernaculars in which to account for such intersections? So any deliberation of what Blackness does and means for everyday life would seem to necessitate at least careful speculation of why Blackness comes into the world. For Blackness marks an edge, constitutes a mode of distinctiveness that is permanently unsettled as a distinction. For it constitutes a human, non-human, beyond humanity that is forced to secure a stabilized entity, a plane of consistency for what is affirmed as human. And this is, of course, Sylvia Wynter's well-known point. As such, Blackness is not only within and outside the ambit of the human, but also beyond its range, beyond the manifestations of the human that white envisioning makes possible, rendering any claim of Black humanity undecidable and sometimes illegitimate, as a proof of speech beyond humanity. Yet at the same time, it manifests a potential sense of humanity beyond any established sensible vernacular of the human. What provokes thinking is the impossibility of a thought that manifests itself as true without ambivalence, without the crisis prompted by the prospects of unassimilable error. So as David Marriott emphasizes, there is thought that cannot be thought within the available terms of signification, that can only reveal its presence, if not content, through the blindness occasioned by an occasioning of crisis, what he calls the nepa of Blackness. The affirmation of the need for whiteness as the grounds for the stability and certainty of thought is in a non-relation to the excesses of Blackness, which prompts the crisis that thought seeks to resolve through whiteness. So beyond the recursions of racialized colonialism, where the brutal outputs of domination always constitute the inputs for the apparatuses of continued colonial rule, Blackness suspends the obligation to consider thought and practice as either viable or functional. It draws attention to all those intersections of ways of doing things and existing with others that serve no function, offer little for extraction, have no instrumental agenda nor identity, and whose value is inconclusive. In other words, the bulk of urban life. And inhabitants always situated in the middle between overwhelming impositions and constant invention. When Fanon so famously registered the young child's pointing him out as negra, this was not the identification of a category of either spite or curiosity, but rather an affirmation of the very condition in which Blackness exists. That is, the inevitability and naturalization of an active sensing that is unable to identify anything without being situated in a state where there can be no discrete identities or persons or subjects. So take the urban, now driven through the hyperproduction of commodified images and experiences, the intricate and nano-level assignation of values, the blurring of the material and immaterial, and relations of derivation which transgress any boundary, registering the discreteness of objects, temporalities, and territories. Sorry about that. The urban must constantly undermine the meanings of whatever it produces to keep going. And this possibility is established through Blackness, which both refuses all identities, the very notion of identity, yet by default comes to stand for the possibility of something more than this refusal. So given that Blackness functions as both excess and lack, it became a nearly universal political technology through which to foreclose individual subjectivity to specific kinds of persons without any consideration as to their own locality, that is, their thoughts, capacities, background, thus prefiguring the homogenizing characteristics of global urbanization. Yet, Blackness came into the world not only as the medium through which the notion of a proper human can be conceptualized, materialized, and fought for, but also as that which renders any place in the end uninhabitable for such propriety. So Blackness is not simply the antithesis of propriety, that which a proper human is set against. It is not simply a failed humanity or an inhuman that can be converted into anything. If the white human is the conceit of an ability to stand alone, then Blackness is that which doesn't stand alone or anywhere, as Fred Moten says, and at the same time is called upon to stand everywhere. As such, Blackness is the possibility of infinite extensionality, the real connective tissue that is constantly cut and wounded so that Black standing can take place. Part 2. Territorial settlements have never been consolidated as a matter of overarching form. Rather, settlements emerge fractally from the continuous circulations of bodies enjoining, exchanging, collaborating with each other, where social differentiation of position is never spatially static, but constituted and reaffirmed by moving in and through space, and creating space through such movement. Take the regenerative capacities of popular districts in cities such as Jakarta, Delhi, Mexico City, Lagos, to name just a few, to endure through what have substantially been auto-constructed modalities of inhabitation and economy. While continuously vulnerable to extractions and manipulations of all sorts, such districts, often through subterfuge, dissimulation, and uncanny effective intelligence, continuously remake themselves to revitalize core modalities of urban practice. Old-fashioned solidarities and reciprocities exist, of course, and these districts could not exist without them. But the prevalent sensibility is that securing life and livelihood rests not so much in the predictable rhythms of neighborly cooperation, but in the unspecified outcomes of all of these densities colliding and acting on each other, producing eventualities of all sorts. Not readily or even always clearly discernible as virtuous or destructive, these eventualities become the things that will alter lives, lift households beyond mere survival, and become that which is lived for. Such eventualities are a collective product of the district, as important as the combined labor of the street seller, the deliverer, the repairer, the construction worker, the childminder, the cook, the cleaner, the metal worker, transporter, and so forth. Residents were always quick to point out that though things have not changed all that much for them, that they know others just down the lane for whom things did change and substantially, even if at times they were reluctant to make these changes visible. That eventually their own lives would change in unexpected and welcomed ways, because these eventualities were indeed the results of the very density of things taking place in the district. The work the urban does in these districts can also be seen as that of institutions honed over long periods of time. These institutions are less instruments of governance than of figuring, recalibrating and experimenting. Institutions such as shrines, burial societies, ethnic associations, and guilds. In addition, more ephemeral forms of collective life also play a role in circulating personal experiences and perspectives through an array of networks and neighbors without fixing residents to specific positions and responsibilities. It is this circuitry of movement and exchange that drives a continuous process of incremental adjustments and sometimes inexplicable leaps in the composition of space. While not immune to biopolitics, these districts instantiated themselves in temporalities of what Frederick Nerot has called pasts that have not lived enough and futures that will never be born, that are proximate to forces not consolidated or consoled by power, but where finitude was ever present, where the specifications of regulated life did not forestall the dramatic presence of the inexplicable. From the open-ended conversations among anyone interested in the Sufi shrines of Lahore, to the convocations of Mexico City brutal techno-fanatics under the metro stations of nearby peripheries, to the inventive cosplay of working-class hustlers in the elite nocturnal spaces of Lagos, to intricately orchestrated and festive coordination of 100,000 street traders in El Alto, Bolivia. The preoccupation is not simply the fortification of existing constitutions, but attention to what can be born within the limits of ecologies whose operations will partly always remain opaque, and the multitude of ghosts, lives for whom there is yet to be justice, that inhabit each convocation. It includes the tentative, always exploratory ways that multiple and limited sovereignties, cartels, syndicates, local authorities, religious activities, women's associations, and market guilds continuously negotiate accords to render consumption affordable for the lower classes of Mexico City. In the now heavily policed working class bastion of Imbaba, Cairo, one of the densest urban districts on earth, a faith in the possibility of an extended reachability has not waned. Imbaba, once the center of Egypt's Islamic movement and the site of prefiguration and rehearsal for the country's 2011 revolution, the physical coherence of the district is being altered through large investments in infrastructural projects whose partial objective is to interrupt everyday circulations. The political capacities of Imbaba have largely been in its extensive network of Zawiya, highly localized Islamic centers that combine pedagogy, neighborhood socialization, information exchange, entrepreneurial collaboration, and social welfare. Articulated to each other, these Zawiya managed to exert substantial political impact. Given the intensity of the state's present surveillance of daily life, much of this has subsided. And even though inhabitants of a neighborhood may spend much of their lives within a very narrow spatial circumference, interacting with the same people day in and day out, there remains a conviction that through the Zawiya they can reach a wider world, a near infinite series of possible connections and opportunities. And even if none of this materializes, they conceptualize their lives as situated on a vast surface of potential articulations, that if need be, it is possible to reach out across a vast distance and be recognized as someone worth being considered. What is embodied in these practices is an indifference to what David Marriott has called the crisis of truth, or the circulation of the circumvention of uncertainty entailed in the fact that language always articulates unanticipated and uncontrollable meaning that have no logic has been intensely racialized, that consigns a thought that has no discernible position or cause to incivility, a life without life. Rather, these districts hedge their endurance on what might be, what could have already been, not with any empirical certainty, but an addressing to and witnessing of the irrelevance and irreverence of its own enactments. For they believe they are surrounded by something else other than the normative conceptualizations of problems and their amelioration, despite the sufferings that are endured. This is not a radical politics of prefiguration, for figures themselves are always prompting inexplicable cognitive and practical engagements with entities and processes that appear distant, for which no relationship is seemingly possible, prompting messy deals and hard bargains. A thin and sometimes oscillating line appears between vociferous collective actors waging antagonisms in the interest of a justice to come, and those interested only in their own self-aggrandizement. The circulations of pirates, cartels, hustlers, brokers, mercenaries, traders, priests, fabricators, casual labor, advisors, and tricksters extend the operations of molar organizations, but also topologically open strange collaborations that neither institutionalize themselves or yield discernible results, but nevertheless exert an unsettling force, undecidable in terms of virtue or destructiveness. So take the multitude of popular districts of the urban majority across the world. At work was a constant, intense interplay between the objectives of consolidating a capacity to the urbanization process to generate specific yet mutable livelihoods and atmospheres of well-being, and as vehicles to secure the promises of continuous betterment offered by notions of citizenship and modernity. The dilemma was always how to extend their inventiveness into new terrain and to use what they were exposed to as a way of extending their capacities. Yet, as we well know, this everyday life is constantly impeded upon. To take some examples of this imposition. Not only the relocation of factories and the return of primitive accumulation, the reascendance of extraction or the profusion of low-level service jobs, but also the deployment of illicit trades as the instrument to configure articulations among different scales and territories. There's increasingly been the weaponization of the dissolution of social ties, the fragmentation of protocols of inheritance, the urbanization of rural areas, the acceleration of mobility, the loosening of family and communal mores, the undermining of extended kin relations, all are interconnected, all become modalities of warfare. Whereas circulation and proximity have become the dominant metaphors of globalization, violence is also used to create distance, that is, to figure the inaccessibility necessary to protect illicit local economies. But violence is also used to create a sense of distance for a threatened public, whereby the public issues a threat itself, backed up by an armed privatization of public space and enforcement of tribute to local authorities. And a third final example is the intensely racialized atmospheres of everyday life, the arbitrary application of rules, the systematic undermining of an extraction from local economies enacted by the police, the omnipresence of security gazes, and the entrenchment of spatial segregation codes all enforce specific bodies and spaces as being perpetually in trouble. The decentralization and diffusion of incarceration beyond the conventional prison model. Therefore, the profusion of initiatives in urban life produces an incessant volatility, where it is often difficult for any actor to steer their objectives intact through the choppy waters of intersections, contestations, and collisions occasioned by agendas trying to make their way through and with each other. So navigation here is a matter of drawing and feeling lines of connection between different horizons, different vantage points, signals, and adjustments. It is not a matter of reading a map and pointing yourself along the shortest trajectory. Rather, navigating through these choppy waters, it is the reliance upon a range of technical maneuvers that brings dimensions of disparate and continuously shifting phenomena and domains and operations into some experiential connection associated with an imagining of a coherent, overarching scene or a world. Any normative presumption of urbanization must now include the realization that the heterogeneities whose intersections constitute both the productive energies and objects of urban economies can also facilitate unyielding violence. The distinct architectures of hospitals, schools, housing projects, interchanges, markets, and transit corridors offer distinct affordances to generalized warfare. And Gaza is only in some way the most intense example of this, where there is an erosion of the difference between the civilian and the military as everything is converted into a legitimate target, in part because each space and body can be scrutinized according to the interoperability of multiple technologies of seeing. We are all being scrutinized and viewed and cross-referenced and correlated in thousands of different ways. And so situations and bodies are often now preempted from assuming some kind of dangerous potential, in part because the political language that might have generated reliable connotations, that might have constituted the general strike or the kinds of forms of resistance that are discernible and shareable, that might have in the past ranked a particular person or scenario within the acceptable bounds of risk management, have themselves become unsettled. Everyone is at risk, everyone a risk, and everyone risks. Yet, still at the same time, every place, coming back to the kind of philosophy of Blackness, is that yet every place we make generates meanings for which we have no language or comprehensive interpretation. Who we are to each other retains something undecidable, unsettled, an ongoing dilemma to which all kinds of politics and techniques are thrown, from property relations to fantasies of justice. Blackness bears the weight of this uncertainty, an uncertainty too dangerous to be thought. So Fanon will argue the importance of throwing into doubt all representation, of each counting of entities and their respective qualities and needs. What are the popular vernaculars, choreographies that intense and solidify and enjoin? Well, they're always at the edge of meaning and knowing. As Moore Mother says in her lyric, we are at the edge. Where the edge is also that interplay on a vast extended surface of multiple interruptions, experiments, queer manifestations, and mutations that make up a plane of fugitive navigation. All the ways in which the flight can blend in, take rest, learn new tricks, forge friendships, lay low, and rehearse acquired knowledge. 3, the Black camera. Back in the day, and this is a long time ago, in the Brooklyn neighborhood that I call home, was the time of the 5 percenters. And the 5 percenters were, as I say, part eschatological, part gang, part NGO, part hustle, part academy. 5 percenters perhaps made most famous through the early days of Wu-Tang Clan. But for the 5 percenters, they had this notion of the Black camera. And the Black camera was this kind of vernacular, that of all the ways in which flight can blend in, take rest, learn new tricks, forge new friendships. The popular vernacular's choreographies that entice, solidify, always at the edge of meaning and knowing. And so the Black camera became this kind of notion that the 5 percenters used to try to point to this. And so what is the Black camera? Well, the way that nurses at Woodhull Hospital, Black cops in souped up patrol cars, ministers and imams from pulpits, supervisors at Con Ed and Bell Telephone, kids running through the sprinklers in summer playgrounds, the baristas in the Starbucks at Broadway Junction take any opportunity to add something extra to any official duty. These are vernaculars of ordinary transactions that add on and tap into a rolling magma, not definitive locatable as something beneath the surface or in the air, to use your Schmittian terms. Less public secret or tacit form of belonging, less I know that you know that I know that we are all in this. Less a tributary of common trauma and anguished endurance or amorphous perfusions of joyfulness. The Black camera is more than a device of effective solidarity, but an intricate relay system of eviscerated grammars, plates of food sent from one home to another, items that fell off trucks, inflated professions of faithfulness, I got you, baby, rapidly assembled shrines to the fallen, mixtapes of Shaolin beats from Angolan shoguns, the running archive of everyday troubled racialized interface that financiers, lawyers, politicians, scientists, and professors confront daily, and the visceral commands of Black Twitter. The Black camera are struggles, eruptions of the to and fro of whatever game comes with its own rules. This contrasts with the mass image, an image of the masses, which really isn't about the image at all, but rather the infinite series of networked relations that are algorithmically composed from extracting from disjoint agencies no longer cohered as subjects, but repertoires of behaviors and inclinations. The camera instead tells a story, which includes relations that may be moving in different directions and at different rates all at the same time, always moving through each other in any attempt to get a hold of it. It's always the profusion of these small gestures of recognition, the ways in which people acknowledge each other without having to acknowledge each other within a sense of common vocabulary. It is a camera, it is a way of being, it is a way of acknowledgement, it is a collective and enunciation that is always on the edge of things. And so I don't want to go into this last slide, except for the last line, that when we talk about the urban world is a Black world, and there is no urbanism that is not Black. Okay, thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Simon. That was excellent. Can you please give him a round of applause again? So there is more to chew in this for us in the next 2 days. We'll have where's Gayatri? Okay, I don't have an idea of how many minutes we have for this Q&A, but I think we should have at least about 5-10 minutes, so we can take a series of questions, maybe about 3 questions. Can you hear me, Professor Simon? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. So maybe I should start. Gayatri, do you have an idea how many minutes we have for Q&A? Or how many minutes are you granting us for Q&A?
We have we have at least 15 minutes. Yeah.
15 minutes, okay, all right. So maybe I should use the opportunity of being here to start, and anyone who has questions, I think they'll pass around the microphone. So I really like your idea of the unspecified outcomes that determines the process of securing life and livelihood. And I was thinking about this in the context of your latest book, Disarray. You seem to find this whole idea of unspecified outcomes very enabling and generating. And I'm wondering that in the lives of some of the people I've studied in some of the urban spaces that have been, why this is potentially so, it can also be very, very debilitating and disenabling. So, but I think you find it more generating and more generative rather, and quite enabling. So I'm wondering whether you also would like to admit, the devastations that these unspecified outcomes can also constitute for lives, even though they can be potentially generating. So that's my question. I think we should take one or two more questions, and then you can take the questions together. Do we have any? Okay, I think you can go ahead and respond to that while others are composing their questions.
Yeah, but this is precisely the point. The point is that the point is that if you're going to try to configure a transformative break, a kind of real movement, a kind of real change, that is the risk that one takes. That there is nothing within the sort of the ameliorative trajectory. There's not a disposition that can be pointed to in advance without risking actions and practices that themselves could potentially intensify vulnerability, in some sense make things worse. I mean, this is in some ways, this is Fanon's point, that if you're really going to sort of break the kind of colonial structure in which we have been embedded in, where the meanings of where the specification, where what if you put something on the table about this is what I am, and this is what I'm able to do, and this is what I will do, you always subject it to a kind of comparative moment where it always itself risks being undermined and being made lesser. And what are the terms of comparison? The terms of comparison are never given the structure of power are never yours. They don't belong to you. So in some ways, the only way to upend that is then to assume the risk that what it is that you invent, what it is that proceeds from something that in some ways has been from the abyss will perhaps be that which completely undermines you. So in some ways, what I talked about in the surrounds was not so much the specific, a certain specificity, which is really specific. The specificity that can't be drawn into a kind of comparison. A specificity that is in some sense unprecedented in the world, that has no discernible history and no discernible future. And so in some ways, it is not just the sense of the unspecific, but a specificity which is in some ways its own universe.
Thank you. Yes. Can you please introduce yourself and mention your university, and then you can ask a question?
I'm George Barak from Lafayette, and I'm really fascinated by this gesture or move towards Blackness as a kind of eater of the social world, particularly in the context of the urban situation or setting, as you put it. And in a way, it reminded me of Ashim Bembe's book, Critique of Black Reason, in which he talks about the becoming Black of the world. And in that orientation, the idea is that racialization or race as a kind of category, organizing category of Blackness, is in a way being democratized. And so race is not so much, if you like, important, as it were. Anybody can be Black in that kind of situation. I thought I heard some kind of parallel in your talk where in the urban setting where the last line particularly where the idea is that no urban world is possible without Blackness. And I'm wondering if you would like to comment a little bit more on this, the idea, the democratization, if you will, of Blackness, beyond race. Thanks.
Any other questions so that we can just take a set of questions together? Okay, all right. Please, you can go ahead, please.
No, I mean, I take Ashil's point, about the becoming Black of the world, and in a way in which the sort of extension of racialization is something that exceeds the normative connotations of Blackness. Here, what I'm trying to suggest is that, the sense that, we call the third world, we call the global South. I think maybe heuristically it could be more generative just to say the black world. And the Black world not as a kind of identity. I'm not so much interested in this talk in Blackness as racialization or as race, but rather the work that Blackness does, that it comes, as I say, to bear the weight of uncertainty, of a way of thinking that can't be thought. That Blackness bears the weight of a kind of bears the weight of having to configure humanity and life in terms of individual subjectivity, in terms of the individual subject, in terms of the self-reflective subject, to the exclusion of ways of being in the world that in some ways get occluded by the establishment of whiteness, ways of being that are dependent upon a kind of, of what Hortense Spillers and others has called a kind of process of enfleshment, a way in which there's a kind of collective way of being in the world that isn't predicated on identity, that's not predicated on the division of raciality. And in some ways, the colonial figure, in some ways to occlude this kind of way of being in the world, which in some ways the South in some ways has come in many different ways to embody. And so if the South, I mean, I heard some brief words that one of the introductory speakers talked about. I mean, there are all different ways to configure and conceptualize the South and its ambiguities and confusions and contradictions, but not to think so much of the South as a kind of geography, but rather as a kind of political ontology, a political ontology of which anti-Blackness and whiteness, I mean, the two go together, whiteness and anti-Blackness, because whiteness cannot exist without anti-Blackness. A way of being in the world which is occluded and foreclosed by the ongoing endurance of whiteness. Because otherwise, how do we account for the fact that Blackness still constitutes in the global imagination, in the global soul, in the global psyche, something that is so excessive, something that is so dangerous, something that is so disturbing, something that is so turbulent, something that cannot be socialized, something that cannot be how do we account for this? This is a kind of planetary phenomenon of which no actor, no institution has yet come to grips with. And so in this way, I would depart from Achilles' notion that the becoming Black of the world is something very different and something else.
Thank you very much. I think we'll close it here. So again, on behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank Professor Simone for that stimulating keynote. And I think we might have one or two announcements, Gayatri. So the first panel will start at 10. So I think we can just have a 10-minute break before that panel. Is there any announcement?
No, just had one cancellation of one speaker, so I just
For the next panel.
For the
Okay,
next panel.
all right.
Yeah.
Again, I thank the dean, I thank the chair of the department, and I thank you all.